Hello dear Motorsport-Magazin friends and Formula One fans. Just a few days after the Mexico Grand Prix, Formula One has already touched ground in Brazil. On Thursday, the media day was on the agenda and there was a lot to talk about. We've had some wild days with crazy rumors. One of them you might have heard. Fernando Alonso and Sergio Perez are supposed to swap cockpits in the 2024 Formula One season. Fernando Alonso from Aston Martin to Red Bull and Sergio Perez from Red Bull to Aston Martin. Sergio Perez has said he will drive 100% at Red Bull in 2024. Everyone has their agenda, including journalists. That's more or less what we hear from Sergio Perez every weekend. It has to be said that he gets asked this question every weekend because after every race there is a new situation. After every weekend there's been another poor performance or something that's happened. Just a few days ago there was the tragic retirement after turn 1 at his home Grand Prix, so the recurring questions from the journalists are not completely out of the blue. Fernando Alonso wasn't quite as cold to the whole thing as Sergio Perez. He was really annoyed by the rumors and said he wasn't taking part in this game. People are making fun of it and just want to create followers through it. And he would make sure that there would be consequences. What consequences there will be, he did not say. But at the same time, Fernando Alonso also said that he explicitly excludes the journalists who were in the room at the press conference in Sao Paulo. He said they are always the same ones. He has already said this season that the level of journalism in Spain is relatively low. However, it has to be said that the whole thing was triggered by a tweet, or whatever you call it now, a post on Platform X, formerly known as Twitter, by the esteemed colleague Albert Fabrega. He is actually a very, very well-informed colleague, not a tabloid journalist. He knows his way around very well, also with technology, so he is a trustworthy colleague who researches very conscientiously. He had tweeted that he had learned something that he didn't want to believe. In other words, a pretty strong rumor, but didn't say at all what he meant by it. Yes, such things should probably not be spread on the internet after all. Then many people came up with the wildest rumors, including the cockpit swap between Fernando Alonso and Sergio Perez. Daniel Ricciardo, by the way, has also had something to say about this because he's repeatedly linked to Sergio Perez's cockpit. He himself has said that this is actually his goal, that he wants to be back in the Red Bull in the long term, but he has said that for 2024 he is completely focusing on AlphaTauri. So much for this saga. Now let's look at the sporting side of things, and that's where it gets really interesting because we have the last sprint of the season. There was a lot of discussion about what we think of the new sprint format, but we don't want to get into that right now. Let's take a look at the consequences of this sprint, which was the last one. In Austin, there were 2 disqualifications. Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton were excluded from the race, and now there are fears that the whole thing could happen again. Why? We're in Interlagos. Interlagos means between the lakes. You all know this track, this wonderful track, lots of bumps, maybe not quite as many as in Austin, but it's already an extremely bumpy track. On top of that, every now and then there are a few new places that have been resurfaced. So the whole thing is already a little bit reminiscent, at least of Austin, not quite as bad, but a little bit. And then another factor comes into play, which is the weather. The meteorologists are predicting rain on Friday, but the rest of the weekend is supposed to be dry. So what's the problem with rain on Friday? Well, that's when we have the only practice session, and after that, it's parc fermé conditions. That means that after this possibly rainy session, the teams have to choose a ground clearance. And with this ground clearance, they then go into qualifying the sprint shootout, the sprint, and also the Grand Prix. And of course, you can gamble because you all know that the lower I can drive my car, the more performance I have at the end. That's particularly serious with these ground effect cars. The teams at the front probably won't take quite as much risk, but further back they will. Why is that so tragic? Well, as I've already said, on the one hand, ground clearance is crucial for the performance of a ground effect car like this, and on the sprint weekend I can't do the tests that I normally do because usually I'm driving with a full tank, an empty tank, with DRS, without DRS, so I have different loads and different levels of suspension compression or not. So I wear the floor to different degrees because everything is aimed at ensuring that I have a maximum of 1 millimeter of wear on the floor plank or on the skid blocks where measurements are taken. The whole thing has to be 9 millimeters thick at the end. We explained in detail last weekend how that is measured, and where the problem lies there and the sprint, that is already a big challenge under normal circumstances. I already mentioned Austin. Yes, there were the bumps, but we also had problems in Baku with Alpine, where both had to break Parc Fermé and had to start from the pit lane, because they could see that with the setup with which they went into qualifying, they wouldn't survive it. They would have greater floor plank wear than is permitted. That's why it's better to break Parc Fermé, start from the pit lane and play it safe. In Austin, we saw the disqualification, and in Spa, we didn't really see anything. But Fernando Alonso told us today that the Red Bulls had to take their foot off the gas in Eau Rouge to protect the floor. Of course, we took a closer look to see if that was really true, and yes, it was. Some people might say that in the Grand Prix there was sometimes a slight drizzle, and Verstappen also had a moment. But no, we checked all that. We compared it with the other teams. The other teams have maybe 5 or 6 laps where they weren't at full throttle. Red Bull, it was almost on every lap. With Max Verstappen, it's wonderful to see he had the penalty. And until he passed Sergio Perez, that is, until he was in first place, he was at full throttle every lap in Eau Rouge. And then he always lifted or even really went completely off the gas to protect the floor in compression. You can really see that wonderfully on the data. So it's a bigger issue than people thought at the beginning of the season. Floor wear is extremely important for performance, and in a sprint like that you can gamble, of course. Red Bull gambled at Spa, but we don't know whether it was enough because the FIA didn't check how badly the floor panels were worn after the race. But since Austin at the latest, the FIA has certainly been keeping a closer eye on how the floor wear is looking. And that's why some people are assuming that we're going to be able to again see cars that start from the pit lane. Because if you only qualify in 16th, 17th or 18th place, then you don't have particularly much to lose. If you start from the pits, then you can change the setup, you can go much more aggressively, and then you might have the advantage in the race. But Günther Steiner, for example, says he doesn't believe that anyone will speculate on this from the start. He rather believes that if you have a bad qualifying, you will then pull this joker, so to speak, and start from the pit lane, but not calculate with it from the start. I'm curious, it's definitely a sensitive topic that will also accompany us this weekend. Now I have a little quiz for you. What's the difference between Max Verstappen and Motorsport-Magazin? In contrast to Max Verstappen, Motorsport-Magazin makes presents. Christmas is almost here and we have the perfect gift for your loved ones. A print subscription. Very important, no subscription trap. After 1 year the whole thing is over. That means you pay a fixed amount, give it to someone and they get 1 year of this wonderful print magazine. Link to it is below in the video description. Why should you take care of it now? This voucher can be printed out, yes, but you can also have it sent to you by mail, which is of course always a bit nicer than from your own printer. If you get it in time, you'll get it all before Christmas. So why do I say Max Verstappen doesn't make presents? Let's go back a year to the Brazilian Grand Prix. We all remember Mercedes won back then. George Russell took his maiden Grand Prix victory, but there was something else. Max Verstappen against Sergio Perez, who should have helped his teammate to finish second in the Drivers' Championship, was asked by the team to let his teammate pass, but said, nope, he's not doing it, and he would have given his reasons before. How will things look in 2023? The starting position is very similar. Max Verstappen has long won the championship, whereas Sergio Perez is still fighting for second place in the Drivers' World Championship. Max Verstappen said that was actually quite a good question, but ultimately it shouldn't always be up to him to get the points. Well, that was a clear message, even though he backed up Perez again overall and actually said that he gets along quite well with him and everything is wonderful. Nevertheless, he is relatively intransigent when it comes to this subject. He said that last year the whole thing had not been discussed well in advance. Now he just hopes that you don't get into this situation in the first place. He thinks that would be better for everybody. So now we actually all hope that it will come to this situation again because we just want to know what would happen. Sergio Perez was also asked about it, of course, and he said no, so far they haven't talked about it, but he's sure that if this situation arises, he'll have Max's support. After Max Verstappen's statements, I'm not quite so sure, but you also have to say that if you look at the last few races, it's rather unlikely that the two will race directly behind each other, but unlikely is not impossible. I'm curious to see how it will turn out. Feel free to post in the comments what you think Max Verstappen would do or will do. And then we have summarized some short news for you. On Thursday, Felipe Drugovic's contract extension at Aston Martin was announced. Brazilian in Brazil, contract extension, that fits of course, but yes, Felipe Drugovich is not a race driver, he is a reserve driver. He will remain so in 2024, and so it is clear, or probably clear, that he will not drive at Williams. Logan Sargent probably has his seat very, very secure. At the same time, it was also announced that Felipe Drugovich will drive the second rookie entry in Abu Dhabi in the first free practice session, replacing Fernando Alonso there. So now you know the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix will take place. That was also one of the wild rumors that went through the media. Abu Dhabi will take place in 2023. Recently there were doubts because of the critical situation in the Middle East, but Formula One says the race is not in danger. Then there's a small innovation regarding the traffic jams in the pit lane, which has also been a big topic over the past few weekends. Drivers are no longer allowed to create a gap in the pit lane itself, but they have now clarified you are allowed to create a gap on the way from the pit exit to the safety car line too, but you now have to go to the left side for that, so drivers who don't want to get in line can just pass. And one more little thing from Kevin Magnussen, he should have been in the FIA press conference today. A few days ago he crashed involuntarily. Today he would have liked to take off, namely from Mexico to Brazil, but his flight was cancelled, so he didn't arrive in time. By the way, this might be a very interesting fun fact at this point. How long do you think it takes to fly from Mexico City to Sao Paulo? Now you may ask yourself, why am I here in the studio and not in Sao Paulo? The flight is actually longer than you might think. 9 hours, 35 minutes for the direct connection. If you have to change planes, it takes much longer. You wouldn't have believed it. Dr. Helmut Marko jokingly said to me, well, it would have been faster for him because he had already been to South America. So Dr. Marko hasn't lost his sense of humor. Kevin Magnussen is said to have arrived later today, so he will be racing this race weekend. Of course, there's also no discussion about where you'll get your information this weekend, namely on our website, Motorsport-Magazin.com. Either you go to our website in the traditional way, or you go to the app or Play Store, depending on which device you have. The app is available free of charge for Android and iOS.